On the 11th of April 1912, the Cedric, a passenger liner of the White Star Line, arrived at Staten Island. Its 16-day passage from Egypt completed Abdul Baha's long journey to America. Newspapers covered his arrival with headlines such as these: "In exile for 50 years, Baha'i leader comes to New York to urge world peace. He favors women's suffrage," and "Persian prophet here. He comes to preach universal peace." Hyperbole aside, his adopted title, Abdul Baha, contained within itself, in its designation of servitude, an implicit reminder of his oft-repeated clarification that he was not, in fact, a prophet. Abdul Baha was born into an aristocratic household in Tehran in 1844. At the age of 8, a government crackdown on his father's faith community led to plundering of all the family's earthly possessions, plunging them into virtual poverty. His family endured half a century in exile. Expelled from their native Iran, they lived in Baghdad for 10 years. They were later exiled by the Ottoman state to Istanbul, followed by a 5-year period of confinement in Edirne, then to the most remote prison city of the Ottoman Empire, Akka, located in modern-day northern Israel. Following the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, when all political and religious prisoners of the Ottoman Empire, including Abdul Baha and his family after nearly 55 years of imprisonment, were set free, he began making plans to share in person his father's teachings with the world beyond the Middle East. 2 years later, he left the confines of Akka, heading first to Egypt, where he stayed for 1 year. In August of 1911, Abdul Baha set sail for Europe, spending a month in London and 2 months in Paris. After returning to Egypt for the winter, he set off again in March 1912 for an 8-month tour of North America, followed by second visits to London and Paris, as well as journeys to Austria, Germany, Hungary, and Scotland. The year was 1912. A fiercely contested election challenged Americans to decide what kind of country they wanted. Minorities and women fought for civil rights. Workers faced off against corporations. Soldiers landed on foreign shores, sparking debate on the nation's role in the world. Did Americans really share Theodore Roosevelt's conviction that the welfare of each of us is dependent fundamentally upon the welfare of all of us? On the 11th of April, Abdul Baha joined the conversation. For 239 days, he traveled across America, reaching across political, religious, racial, class, and gender lines to present Americans with a compelling vision of human nature, social unity, and the nation's future. His 8-month journey took him to 38 localities in 15 states, as well as the provinces of Quebec and Ontario in Canada. During his journey, Abdul Baha gave over 400 talks to approximately 93,000 people. He spoke in 31 moderate and progressive Protestant churches, 14 theosophical and other metaphysical gatherings, 5 universities, 3 synagogues, 1 African American church, the Lake Mohonk Peace Conference, Hull House, and the 4th Annual NAACP Conference. In churches and synagogues, Abdul-Baha emphasized the essential unity of all the world's revealed religions. He emphasized the principle that all religions originate with the same divine source and represent progressive revelations of God's will to humanity. At Howard University and the NAACP, he called for race unity in America and challenged America to go beyond tolerance, to embrace diversity completely, and to demolish racial barriers in law, education, and even marriage. At the Lake Mohonk Peace Conference, he spoke of the oneness of humanity. In his words, all the wars which have taken place since the inception of human history have emanated either from religious prejudice, racial prejudice, patriotic bias, or political greed and interest. As long as these prejudices last, so long will the foundations of humanity tremble. Abdul-Baha's talks covered a breadth of topics, but he predominantly addressed 5 pressing issues facing American society: the oneness of humanity and the pressing urgency of race unity, the oneness of religions and the need for harmony between science and religion, the equality of women and men, and the need for universal suffrage, the inevitability of universal peace, and the need to end the production of instruments of war. Abdul-Baha spoke to his audiences in Persian, with simultaneous translation into English. To the extent feasible in each case, transcriptions were made for posterity by responsible persons in both Persian and English. The travels of Abdul-Baha comprised the 9 months of April through December of 1912. His travels took him to the following places, mostly by train: eastern states, including New York, Washington, D.C., Maryland, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. Central states, including Wisconsin, Ohio, Minnesota, Nebraska, Colorado, Utah, and Illinois, where he laid the foundation stone for the first Continental Baha'i Temple in the Western Hemisphere, and California, where he arrived on the 2nd of October, remaining for nearly 3 weeks. He addressed audiences both large and small, also meeting many distinguished Americans, including President Theodore Roosevelt, Alexander Graham Bell, Gibran Khalil Gibran, Admiral Perry, W.E.B. Du Bois, Andrew Carnegie, Reverend Howard Colby Ives, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, and many others. Abdul-Baha arrived in California in October of 1912, the furthest point on a 12,000-kilometer journey that began in Tehran some 60 years earlier during his childhood. Perhaps it is significant that it was at this apex of his life travels that he delivered one of the most celebrated of his talks in America. On the second day of his stay in California, he received a visit from the president of Stanford University, David Starr Jordan, who officially invited him to speak to the student body and faculty on the 8th of October at 10:15 a.m. The large auditorium was filled to capacity with 1,800 students and 180 faculty and staff. It was a rare occasion when the entire university was called to attend one guest lecture. Jordan mounted the stage with Abdul-Baha and began his words of introduction. It is our portion to have with us one of the great religious teachers of the world, one of the natural successors of the old Hebrew prophets, Jordan began. He is said sometimes to be the founder of a new religion. It is not exactly a new religion, however. The religion of brotherhood or goodwill, of friendship between men and nations, that is as old as good thinking and good living may be. It may be said, in some sense, to be the oldest of religions. Then, Abdul-Baha spoke extemporaneously, at length. Early in his talk, he stated, "Inasmuch as the fundamental principle of the teaching of Baha'u'llah is the oneness of the world of humanity, I will speak to you upon the intrinsic oneness of all phenomena." It was a theme he had presented many times in America, but at Stanford he approached it from a scientific perspective. He then turned to the delusions that lead to war, speaking of the torrents of precious blood spilled in defense of these imaginary divisions of our one human habitation under the delusion of a fancied and limited patriotism. He continued, "We live upon this earth for a few days, and then rest beneath it forever. Shall man fight for the tomb which devours him? For his eternal sepulchre? What ignorance could be greater than this? To fight over his grave, to kill another for his grave. What heedlessness, what a delusion." Abdul Baha ended his Stanford remarks with these wishes: "It is my hope that you who are students in this university may never be called upon to fight for the dust of the earth." With this poignant farewell to the Stanford community, Abdul Baha concluded the westward leg of his journey across America. His visit to Stanford, the first by an eminent Iranian to include an address of such magnitude, and his message of the oneness of humanity and the pressing urgency of race unity, the oneness of religions and the need for recognition of the harmony of science and religion, the equality of women and men, and the need for universal suffrage, and the inevitability of universal peace, will continue to provide a path forward for a humanity seeking its golden age.